Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. In this video, we will actually take a look at different profiles in Spring Boot. So if you're developing a backend with Spring Boot, then it's very likely you don't want to run your production code in the development phase. Because especially if things like a database are involved, then it's very easy to mess things up. It's very easy to accidentally drop your entire production database if you use it during development purposes. So in the real world, we typically want to have clear, distinguished environments where each of these environments just has dedicated config set that is just optimal for that specific environment. In this video, I will show you how we can set up a development, a staging, and a production environment here in Spring Boot, where each of these can get individual pieces of config and where we can have individual beans for each type of environment. So just quickly for clarity, the development environment is really, as the name says, purely used for development. That is the code that you run when you actively develop more features, when you actively fix certain bugs. So probably the code that you have in your IDE here. The staging environment is mainly used for testing before you want to move a certain release into the production phase. So here you maybe want to have production similar config, but maybe not use the production database, for example. So you want to have the entire environment as close to production as possible, while still not having the risk of breaking something that is currently in production. And then lastly, we have the production environment, which is typically just the environment where the code runs on if it's deployed on your remote machine, which could also be the case for the staging environment. So this could also be deployed variant, but the production one is for sure one. So typically the flow is developers develop something in the dev environment. Then once the developers think, okay, that's actually ready for release, they move that into the staging environment, where you then maybe have a team of testers testing this staging environment. And if those testers also say, yes, that's a yes from us, then the staging environment gets moved into the production phase, where it's then finally live for the real users. And in Spring Boot, this differentiation works by so-called profiles. And I want to start having a simple sample setup here. I've created a blank Spring Boot project with just 2 extra dependencies. So on the one hand, I have the PostgreSQL dependency, since in regards to databases, there of course are typically differences between which DB you want to connect to in the development phase versus which DB you want to connect to in the production phase. But this could really be any database. You don't need to work with exactly the dependencies that I show here, but we just need something in order to set up some differences between those different phases. And normally when you just create a new blank Spring Boot project, you end up with this application properties file. So this is really the central file where the Spring Boot config, either for Spring Boot for the framework itself, or for certain libraries and dependencies to use, is configured and is set up. By default, we really just see our name here, but we are very welcome to actually extend this. For example, if we are using a database, then this would be the place where we say, okay, this is actually the connection string for this database. Here's the user. This is the password for the user. That should automatically connect to this instance. And by default, everything we type here will be applied to all kinds of environments in your Spring Boot instance. However, that's not why we're here. We want to set up specific environments for different phases. And that works by simply creating multiple application properties files where we have just one file per development stage. So dev, staging, and production. So we want to take this file, we want to copy paste this, and the notation that a Spring Boot works with here is simply having application-dev. So this would be the properties file for our development environment. And now the way this works is that we still want to keep this application properties file because that includes all the shared config. So all the config we put in here will just be applied to all these stages. All the code we put in here will just be applied to the dev state. So we can actually remove the name because that's already specified in the shared application file. And that's also something we wouldn't want to change between development, staging, and so on. Something we do need to do is that we need to instruct Spring in order to activate this specific config file for a specific variant. So that works with spring.activate on profile, spring config activate on profile. And here we specify the name of the environment that we actually want to have here, so in our case dev. And then all the config in this file will be used for the dev variant. And now this would also be a place where we can set up the development-specific config for our development-related database instance. Since we're using PostgreSQL, we want to set this up with spring.dataSource. You can see with a username, a password, and a URL. And here, I won't actually set up a real DB, but I will create a sample local database connection string here, how it would look like in the real world. For Postgre, that is jdbc : PostgreSQL : / and now we say, okay, that's running on localhost on our local machine. the typical port for PostgreSQL databases, / our DB name, for example, MyDB or whatever you called your DB. Other than that, we can then specify the password, so Spring data source.password. Here we can say something like devpass. We can do the same for the username. Username is dev user, for example. And it's actually quite common that these credentials for test development database are actually hard-coded directly here in this file, because a common practice here for development databases is that the DB is simply recreated on every single launch of the Spring Boot instance. So you don't really have a completely persistent DB instance here that you always connect to on your local machine. Sometimes you do, and in these cases you could also move these variables here to an environment variable or so you don't leak these in version control. But very commonly, we also just recreate an entirely new instance of the DB with these credentials, where we just always insert some sample data that we just work with on a development basis. And then it's totally fine to actually hard-code these things here in the properties file, of course, only for the development variant. Another piece of config that would make sense to apply here in the development properties file is to configure Flyway. So Flyway is in the end a tool that takes care of migrating our DB instances. So if you change something about your SQL schema, then a Flyway will take care of taking the old DB, migrating it to the new schema so that nothing breaks in the actual instance. And here we could, for example, say Spring Flyway clean disabled, and we say true just for the development properties. So what this means is that you cannot turn on destructive migrations. So instead of performing real migrations where you have an existing DB instance where each field is then migrated to something new if it changed, with clean disabled, we say, okay, just drop the entire DB, recreate it if there is a migration, because that way issues can't ever happen. That's of course something that would be catastrophic in production, because you would lose all your production data. But in development, this is a very common thing to just not have to worry about migrations either way. We could also say something like Spring SQL init platform, and we set this to platform but mode. We set this to always. So this allows every developer, for example, to set up a sample database, a test database for development purposes in a single step without having to set up Flyway to deal with any migrations, because as I said, we don't really need that in development mode anyways. Sometimes you would also need to set this up in your CI pipeline in order to make this work. By setting this to always, at least in the development phase, we don't need to do all that. And again, this is really just some example config that I'm typing here that would make sense to have for dev, staging, and production. But of course, you can apply any type of config that you would want to apply to your Spring Boot backend here. So let's leave that at least for our DB. Something else that we commonly want to configure differently, at least for the different stages, for the different environments, is logging. So how fine-grained logging you actually want. In your development mode, typically you want to have very fine-grained logging. You maybe want to turn on debug logs so that you see every little log line. And if something goes wrong, then you can directly spot that issue in your IDE. While in production, we often rely on something like an external logging framework or so, where we send our logs to some kind of remote, maybe a cloud provider or so that manages these logs for us. And then we often just pay for the log storage. So the more logs there are, the more we pay. So in production, it is often a good idea to just include the warning logs, so everything from the warning logs at least, while leaving all the debug logs aside, where we could also possibly leak sensitive data. So for example, here in dev, we could say logging, what is that? Logging dot level. And then we can specify the log level for a specific package either, or here for root, so for every single log, to be at least a specific level. So for example, we could say org Spring Framework, and this would set the log level for all Spring-related classes here to debug for our development environment. Now let's leave that for our dev environment. In order to now set up the next one, staging, let's take this application dev properties, copy paste this, and call this application staging properties. There we go. Rename dev to staging here, of course. And now for staging, we maybe want to connect to a DB instance that is a bit more sensitive and that we just don't want to spin up with our dev credentials here. Maybe it's of course dependent on how you manage this at your company or at your backend. But just to also show you how that would work if these things actually shouldn't be leaked inside of our properties file and therefore in GitHub or so in your version control system, we can of course take those and replace them with environment variables or something you get from a secret manager ideally by saying curly braces open, and then we don't put this in here, but we put in the name of that. So something like our Postgre URL or Postgres SQL URL, something like this. And then this gets referenced, for example, from our environments file, where we can then set this up by going to our run configuration, edit configurations, click here. And if you don't have the environment variables as a text field here, you can click modify options, environment variables, and then you will see another text field here where we can click on this little paper icon or so to edit that. And here we can enter those key value pairs like PostgreSQL URL, and we paste our staging related DB URL here. And we assume that this would be the one, as well as setting up our PostgreSQL user, where you say, okay, user, and oops, and lastly, PostgreSQL password, something like that. And then we say password. And these would, of course, be variables if the staging instance is running on a remote machine that you wouldn't set up here in your IDE, but on your remote machine in a separate environment variables file, for example. But just in order to show you how we can reference these here in the properties file, just here in the IDE, but this would really just apply to the staging variant if you run this directly in the IDE, which I will also show you. So here we have PostgreSQL password, something like that. And we can copy this and have the user as well. And this way we don't include all those details here in our version control system. Yeah, and something else we could do, well, for staging, we could apply a little bit more general logging, so maybe not include all debug logs. Let's say everything from info logs or more dangerous. But for example, if we say we want to have very fine-grained logging for our own logs that we have in our project, so the logs that we really initiate with our own logger that don't come from a library, we could also set that from logging level, and then we specify our package name, our project, or actually just our package name to include all modules. And we say that's, for example, debug. So our own logs will still be shown for the debug variant, while the others only from info. If you want, you could also set up a specific port here just for the staging variant. If you say that runs on a different port, you could say, okay, 8085, for example. I think you get the idea. Let's next get to production. So we copy staging, paste that here, and say we have our production variant. Also specify this here, production. This can stay the same because in production, we definitely want to load those credentials here from some kind of secret manager or environment variables at least. And here we definitely don't want to have clean disabled. I think I said it the wrong thing here. This should be false for development. So clean disabled should be false. So it's enabled. That's a bit misleading. I never like when people actually negate booleans by default, because this always increases the cognitive load that you need to negate it in your brain to see, okay, what is true, what is false. If it would be called clean enabled, it's clearer what false and what true means, and they can still default it to true in that case, or to false. So you want to have false. For the staging variant, you want to have true, because here it's likely you still connect to some kind of persistent DB that isn't recreated on every launch. And for production, definitely want to have this to true, so you don't accidentally drop your production data when there is a migration happening. And for production, we could then specify something like logging level.root, and we set this to warn. This will really only include warnings in your log statements in your real production instance. So the logs will look much more empty than in your development mode, which may be what you want. Maybe if you don't want this, if you want more fine-grained logs, you can either, as I said, specify this on a per package basis, or I think even on a per class basis. But I think you get the idea. For production, we want to keep this at something that maybe does not include debug logs at least. Something else we may want to include for production is management.endpoint.health show details. I want to set this to never. This actually comes from a tool called Actuator, Spring Boot Actuator, which I've included here as a dependency. This one here, that's pretty much a tool that provides a health endpoint, so something to make a ping to and check whether your instance is still running. And under certain conditions, this can show certain details that you may not want to expose for your production Spring Boot instance. So just details about maybe the machine your backend is running on, maybe the left disk space or so, that may be important for debugging this and for checking this. That's something you definitely don't want to have in production. This is already set to when authorized. So people can already see can only see those details when they make an authorized request. But the safest, if you don't care about that in production, is to just set this to never, so you don't accidentally leak such server-sensitive details. Cool. I think that is enough to understand how this works with these different properties files. Of course, we could now have a certain shared config that would apply to all those environments. So here for PostgreSQL, for example, we could say Spring data source dot driver class name to specify the database driver, which could be org PostgreSQL dot driver. We could say Spring pool size here, data source maximum pool size. Set that to something like 12 or so, really just some samples that you could set up here that apply to all of these config files, so you get an idea of what may be config that we want to share. We want to enable Flyway here, definitely for all these variants. So Flyway enabled is true. We could specify the locations here for Flyway, so where it looks for those DB migrations, but that's already the default, so you don't actually need to change those two since it's enabled by default. But just that you get an idea of what would make sense here. Well, let's actually check if this really works. And for that, I will create a little helper class, and that class will be a bean, so a class that Spring Boot, the framework itself, manages and creates. Because with such a bean, we can also define that we only want to have certain beans for specific profiles, so development, production, staging. And that is something we can do in here. So we'll create a super simple dummy class that really just prints something when our application boots up, but just in the debug build, in the development build, I mean. So here we could create something like dev diagnostics or so, make this a class, and I accidentally made it a Kotlin class, but this is a Java project. So I want to get started creating Spring Boot Java backend, since that is way more in demand in the industry than Kotlin, even though Kotlin is the cooler language. But let's create a Java class here, or Kotlin if you're using Kotlin, and call this dev diagnostics, make this a class. And in here we could have a public command line runner, so that's the return type. Call this run or so. We don't need any arguments because all we want to do is we want to have some kind of log statement. So what we could return here is args, and we map this to something like system.out println. We make a normal console statement where we say hello, and this should actually only print in our development mode. So on the one hand, we need to say, hey, this function is a bean, so managed by Spring Boot, and this dev diagnostics class is a configuration, so that's also managed by Spring Boot automatically. And we now want to say we enable a profile here. So with the profile annotation, we can say, hey, this should only be for the dev variant, and then this class will simply be not instantiated and especially not called here in staging and production. So the last thing we now need to do is we need to actually set up a way for us to run the instance, the Spring Boot instance here, on those different environments. So to run the dev build, the staging build, and the production build. And that works via certain run configurations. So here under run configurations, we can say edit. We call this normal one, the default one, simply dev, for example. And here for these active profiles, we can say that is dev. Then we can click on this here, duplicate this. Here we have a staging one. Here the active profile must be staging. The last one for production. This is of course just something to demonstrate here. It's probably not something that you want to have in your IDE to not accidentally mess something up. But of course, when then deploying your instance, this must be built with a production profile. So if we click apply, then we now see our 3 profiles here. We can run the dev build. And what I actually need to do just here, you maybe as well, is to disable the DB stuff here, since I don't really have a DB instance running on my machine. So this will fail because of that. So we could say something like this, which I'll paste here, that we simply exclude certain classes from auto-configuring these, specifically those classes that are that have the job to set up our PostgreSQL instance, so our code doesn't crash because of that. But of course, in a real project, you would want to set up a real DB. If we now run this and then take a look here what this will actually give us, then we see some console outputs, and the process actually finished. In my case, this could simply be because I have not set up any underlying server that keeps this instance running, like Tomcat, for example. But what is relevant is we do see our println statement here, hello from dev. And the interesting part is now, if we go to staging, we select staging here, and we rerun this, then the process may finish again, but we don't see our println statement here. You can also see we get way less logs here for our development build. And in the production, we get even less. So if we do this, run this, then we only get this Spring Boot banner, which we can, by the way, also disable via settings. So if you don't want this in production, you can say something like spring.banner main banner mode, and we just turn it off. If we then reload this, then you really get a blank console. Yes, it finished again, which of course wouldn't happen in a real instance. But here, there are no logs being printed since there are no warnings that have been printed in our case. And this dev profile, this command line runner really only executed for the development build. The last question that now remains is, if you actually deploy this instance, how do you make sure that the remote instance that is running is actually using the production profile here? By default, is when we bundle a jar file here in Spring Boot, which is an executable Java file which we want to deploy, Spring Boot bundles all our profiles together in that single jar file. So that means at the moment we run our jar file, that is the place where we need to also select the profile we want to run. And that works by just going to our terminal here. If we're using Gradle like here, we can build the jar file with Gradle W clean build or boot jar, I think. If you're using Maven, this command looks slightly different, but in the end, you just need to generate a jar file, call clean build here. Then this will do its thing for a moment. And if we take a look in the build folder under libs, that is where it has generated our profiles jar. So this is the jar we need to run. We need to push to our remote machine, run over there, but with specific command line arguments. So if we go to our terminal and we cd into our build folder /libs, then we can now say java jar spring boot, and we take the normal jar, and now we can say / spring profiles.active is equal to production. If we do this, we will run this. We did not get any outputs here. Let's test this with dev maybe. Yes, you can see lots of outputs here, which is exactly what we've seen before. So in dev mode, we get lots of logs, while in production, and we did not get any. And here it will also not print that it finished with an exit code, which is why we did not see anything for the production environment. Awesome, hope you enjoyed this. If you like these back-end Spring Boot related videos, then make sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because I definitely plan to do more of these. Thanks so much. I will see you back in the next video. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye-bye.